Good evening. Tonight's story is about reading, specifically, about how a form of writing that no one had been able to read for around 1400 years was slowly, carefully worked out again. There is no chase in it and nothing is at stake. It is mostly people at desks. You do not need to follow the argument, and you certainly do not need to remember the languages involved. If you fall asleep during the first paragraph, you will have missed nothing that matters. Let yourself settle. We will go slowly, and the tone will not change. Begin with the loss. For roughly 3,500 years, Egyptian was written in hieroglyphs, the small carved pictures of birds, hands, water, reeds, seated figures. It was used on temple walls, on statues, on coffins, on the walls of tombs. Alongside it, everyday Egyptian was written in quicker, more flowing scripts, which we call hieratic and, later, demotic. Then the world around it changed. Egypt came under Greek and then Roman rule. Christianity spread, and the temple priesthoods, who were the people who actually knew how to write hieroglyphs, gradually ceased to exist. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription we know of was cut in the year 394 of the Common Era, at the Temple of Philae in the far south. The last demotic inscription there dates to about 452. And then that was that. The Egyptian language did not die, it carried on being spoken, and was written in a modified Greek alphabet as Coptic, the language of the Egyptian Christian Church, which is still used in its liturgy today. But the pictures on the walls became silent. People walked past them for 14 centuries and could see that they meant something and could not tell what. In the meantime, a very tempting wrong idea took hold. Because the signs are pictures, it was widely assumed that they must be picture writing, that each sign stood for an idea rather than a sound. A Greek author writing in late antiquity, Apollo, produced a book of explanations along these lines, some of which are correct and many of which are inventive. In the 17th century, a learned Jesuit in Rome, Athanasius Kircher, produced elaborate translations of obelisks on this basis. His translations were, essentially, entirely wrong. He read a short royal name as a lengthy mystical statement about the divine. It is easy to be unkind about this, but the assumption was reasonable on the face of it. If the writing is made of pictures, why would it not mean what the pictures show? Kircher also did something genuinely valuable. He studied Coptic seriously, and argued that it was descended from the language of the ancient Egyptians. He was right about that, and it turned out to be the essential piece. So the man who got the writing most spectacularly wrong also supplied the tool that would eventually get it right, which is a fairly ordinary way for knowledge to work. Now the stone. In 1799, French soldiers were working on fortifications near the town of Rashid, which Europeans called Rosetta, on the western branch of the Nile in the delta. Repairing an old wall, they came upon a slab of dark stone, broken, with writing on one face. It is granodiorite, a hard speckled rock, and it stands about 112 centimeters high. An officer recognized that the inscription was in 3 different scripts and that this might matter, and it was set aside rather than built back into the wall. That decision is the whole story in one small act of attention. The text turned out to be a decree issued by priests at Memphis in the year 196 before the Common Era, in the reign of a young king, Ptolemy V. In content it is unexciting, it confirms honors for the king, and lists tax concessions and temple privileges. Its value lies entirely in the fact that it was written out 3 times, in hieroglyphs at the top, in demotic in the middle, and in Greek at the bottom. And Greek could be read perfectly well. Some years later, after the French position in Egypt collapsed, the stone passed into British hands under the terms of surrender, and it has been in the British Museum since 1802. It is worth saying plainly that the stone did not decipher anything by itself. This is the popular version, a bilingual text, therefore an instant key, and it is not what happened. The 3 sections are not laid out line for line. The hieroglyphic portion is badly damaged, with only the last 14 lines surviving, and the top of the slab is missing altogether. And even with a Greek translation in front of you, You cannot get from it to a script whose basic principles you do not understand. You would not know whether you were looking at sounds, or words, or ideas, or all three. What the stone provided was a reliable set of expectations, a passage of Egyptian whose meaning was known, against which guesses could be tested. That is enormously useful. It is also only the beginning of about 20 years of work by a number of people, some of whom disliked each other. It is worth adding that the Rosetta Stone was not unique, and was never the only evidence. Other bilingual and trilingual decrees have since been found, and one of them, a very similar priestly decree from Canopus, was discovered later and confirmed the reading independently. Scholars also had a growing body of copied inscriptions arriving from Egypt through these years, obelisks, temple walls, papyri, which meant that any proposed rule could be checked against a great many other texts. Decipherment is not really a moment of insight. It is a long process of accumulating enough material that a wrong idea eventually has nowhere left to hide. Copies were made and distributed to scholars across Europe, which was itself an important step. Plaster casts and printed impressions went out widely. Progress came in pieces. A Swedish diplomat named Johan Ackerblad, working on the demotic section, correctly identified a number of personal names and some words, using Coptic. A French Orientalist, Sylvestre de Sacy, made early progress and then handed the problem on. Then, from around 1814, an English physician and polymath called Thomas Young took it up. Young was formidably clever and interested in almost everything. He had already done famous work on the nature of light. He made real advances. He established that the demotic script was related to the hieroglyphic one rather than being entirely separate. He worked out that the oval rings enclosing certain groups of signs, which we call cartouches, contained royal names. And he correctly identified several of the sound values in the name Ptolemy. But he did not take the final step. He continued to believe that hieroglyphs were fundamentally symbolic, and that sound signs were a special arrangement used only for writing foreign names such as those of the Greek kings. That is a very reasonable position, and it is a ceiling. The man who went through that ceiling was Jean-François Champollion, born in 1790 in the town of Figeac in southwest France. He was drawn to ancient Egypt as a boy, and by his teens was studying whatever old languages he could reach. This is where his real advantage lay, and it was not brilliance so much as preparation. He learned Latin and Greek, then Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Aramaic, Persian, Ethiopic. And crucially, he learned Coptic, thoroughly, and appears to have used it privately, writing notes to himself in it, and in one letter saying that he spoke Coptic to himself for the pleasure of it. Kircher had suggested Coptic was the descendant of ancient Egyptian. Champollion took that seriously enough to build his mind around it. So when the moment came to test whether a group of signs might spell a word, he had a vocabulary of actual Egyptian words in his head to test them against. He was also poor, often unwell, and on the wrong side of French politics more than once, which cost him positions. The work went on through all of it, in libraries and in cheap rooms, for the better part of 2 decades. Here is the idea at the center of it, and it is the thing I would like you to take away, though you may take it away in the morning rather than now. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing is not one system. It is several at once, mixed together in the same sentence. Some signs stand for sounds, mostly consonants, in groups of 1, 2, or 3. Some signs stand for whole words. And some signs stand for nothing at all when read aloud. They sit silently at the end of a word to tell you what kind of thing it is, a sign of a walking pair of legs after a verb of motion, a sign of a seated man after a word about a man. These are called determinatives. So a single word might be spelled out in sound signs and then given a picture at the end to remove any ambiguity, rather as if we wrote a word and then added a small drawing to say which sense we meant. Everyone before had been trying to decide whether the script was pictures or sounds. The answer was that the question was wrong. It is both, deliberately, at the same time, and the mixture is the whole design. The step that made this visible came from names. Champollion had the cartouche of Ptolemy from the Rosetta stone, and, from an obelisk brought to England from Philly, the cartouche of Cleopatra. Comparing them, the shared sounds fell into place, the same sign for the P, the same sign for the L, and so on. That much confirmed sound values, but only in Greek names, which is where Young had stopped. The decisive moment came in September of 1822, when he received copies of inscriptions from the temple at Abu Simbel Old Egyptian, long before any Greek ruler. In one cartouche he found a sign he knew meant sun, which in Coptic is re, followed by two signs he already knew stood for the sound S, and one in the middle he suspected was M Rems Rameses. A native Egyptian royal name, written phonetically. Sound signs were not a special foreign import. They were how the script had always worked. There is a famous story that he ran to his brother's office, said something like "I have got it," and collapsed. The account comes from his brother, written down long afterwards, and it may well be tidied up. The letter he wrote a few days later, however, is entirely real, and it is where the modern reading of Egyptian begins. What followed was more work, which is generally how these things go. Being able to sound out names is a long way from being able to read a language. Over the next few years he worked out the grammar and a great deal of the vocabulary, and in 1828 he finally went to Egypt itself, at the age of 37, and stood in front of walls he could read. Accounts of that expedition describe him copying enormous quantities of text, correcting earlier scholars' drawings, and being deeply happy. He came home, was appointed to a chair of Egyptian antiquities created for him, and died not long afterwards, in 1832, aged 41. His Grammar of Ancient Egyptian and his dictionary were both published after his death, prepared by his brother, who had supported him financially for most of his life and who deserves rather more mention than he usually gets. There was a long dispute, especially in England, about how much Champollion owed to Young. The reasonable modern view is that Young opened several important doors and Champollion walked through the one that mattered, and that he could only do so because he had spent his youth learning Coptic. Neither of them would have got there alone. The consequence is difficult to overstate, and it is worth stating quietly. Before this, ancient Egypt was known almost entirely from the outside, from Greek and Roman writers, from what could be seen, from guesswork. Afterwards, 3,000 years of Egyptian writing became available in their own words. Not only royal proclamations, either. Letters, contracts, court records, school exercises with a teacher's corrections, medical texts, love poems, a workman's note explaining why he did not come to work, giving reasons that sound entirely familiar. A whole civilization stopped being mute. And it began with a broken slab found in a wall because one officer thought 3 scripts on one stone might be worth keeping, and continued because a man in a cold room in France was willing to spend 20 years on a problem with no guarantee that it could be solved at all. Most of that time he was not making progress. He was reading, and comparing, and being patiently wrong. That is what the work actually looked like. The stone itself is still in London, in a case, with a great many people around it every day, most of whom look at it for less than a minute. It is not much to look at. Dark, chipped along the top, covered in small dense lines. You would walk past it in a garden wall, which is more or less what happened for the better part of 2,000 years. So we will leave him there, at a desk, late, with copies of inscriptions spread out and a candle burning down, quietly comparing one bird-shaped sign with another. Nothing has happened yet. It will, in a few years, and it does not need to happen tonight. Let the small pictures blur and go where they like. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.